Okay, next unit deals with linkage institutions, and so one of the linkage institutions that we're going to be looking at first, because they play a major role in politics, is going to be political parties at the state level. And so before we begin talking about political parties at the state level, we really need to understand what a linkage institution is. And just like it sounds, it's an institution that connects or links the people with the government. It's some sort of a conduit that helps to bring those two entities together. And so, as we're going to be looking at in depth, they could be political parties. We'll be looking at interest groups. We'll be looking at political action committees. And even the media is a linkage institution because it conveys a message from one of those institutions, i.e., government, to the people. And so we're going to look at political parties today, and remember that we're looking at these through the lens of Texas, as it is Texas government. But political parties are defined as organizations that act as an intermediary between the people and government, with the goal of getting their members elected to public office. So it's obviously they're going to have some sort of an ulterior motive, and their ulterior motive is to ensure that their members are elected to office so that they can affect policy in ways that they see best. In Texas, overall, as you know, probably, or you've heard of at least, you may not understand them, but as you've heard of in the United States, there are two major political parties in the United States. Obviously, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But in Texas, historically, even though there are two political parties, our state has been dominated by one political party over another. And so our history as a state is really dominated by this idea. And so we're going to look as we move forward how one political party has dominated over another, and how at some point in that time there will be a shift from the dominant political party to a new dominant political party. But just a few words regarding political parties in general. By and large, political parties at the state level are very strong. We actually have a very weak national party at the federal level because overall, we only have the president and vice president that are elected by the entire nation. And we could even argue that, they are actually elected at the state level because of the Electoral College. And so because there is actually a lack of politicians being elected by everybody in the United States, the national party is very weak. And we actually see only the emergence of a national political party every 4 years whenever they have their conventions and they nominate candidates and things of that nature. But the political parties are going to be much stronger at the state level. So we will see some kind of influence exerted, especially in those presidential election years by national parties. But by and large, most of the control of the political party will be at the state level. And so as a consequence, not all Democrats are going to look the same. They're going to look different depending on which state that you're in, because Texas Democrats are going to significantly look different from California Democrats or Massachusetts Democrats, and vice versa. Republicans are not going to look the same in Texas as they do in California, as they do in Alaska, as they do in Florida. So the reason for this is because of the different political culture and the different interests in each individual state. So we essentially have 50 state party organizations that act independently of the others and of the national party organization. And so there is a clear distinction between federal and state office holders. And so we're going to see by and large, them operate in very different realms from one another. And occasionally, federal and state legislators might come together on common ground, but most often they have different interests, they have different agendas, they have different priorities. And although state elected officials might carry the Democratic or the Republican label, very little interaction occurs between state and national parties or officials. And so, there is a political scientist named V.O. Key Jr. That suggested that quote, the institutions developed to perform functions in each state differ markedly from the national parties. It is an error to assume that the political parties of each state are but miniatures of the national party system. In a few states, that condition is approached, but each state has its own pattern of action, and often it deviates markedly from the forms of organization commonly thought of as constituting party systems, end quote. And so it's a very valid point that the state parties are going to vary widely across the nation. And really, their only common link is going to be the name that they associate with, whether it be Democrat or Republican. But there are some significant strengths of the political parties at the state level. So we have the Democratic Party. We obviously have the Republican Party, but you have to understand that that is only a name, and by and large, ideology is going to play a bigger role in state parties than an actual name or term associated with your political party. And so things are based on ideology. And ideology is the basic belief system that guides political theory and policy, typically conceptualized as falling along a conservative, moderate, liberal continuum. And so instead of political party association, it's really going to be the ideology that will guide politicians. And so we're actually going to look at that a little bit as we move forward. In modern day, we associate the Democratic Party with a much more liberal ideology. We associate the Republican Party with a much more conservative ideology. But in fact, back after the Civil War and through much of the 20th century, that's going to be flipped. The Republican Party was the much more liberal party. Their ideology was much more liberal, and the Democratic Party was much more ideologically conservative. And so don't be fooled by a name. Sometimes people make arguments about their political party being the best because, for example, in the Republican Party, Lincoln was the one that freed the slaves. Well, yes, he was. And it is the Republican Party, but the Republican Party of Lincoln looks nothing like the Republican Party of modern day because there has been a shift in ideology. And in fact, the Republican Party of Lincoln's day looked much more like a Democratic Party that we're more familiar with. So ideology is going to play a very huge role in the governing of a place and the policies that are put into effect. And so we really need to pay more attention to the conservative, moderate, liberal continuum than we necessarily might do for the Democratic term or the Republican term, because there are some conservative Democrats. Even though they are considered to be a liberal party, if you look at Joe Manchin in West Virginia, he's a very, very conservative Democrat. He's a sort of an old school Democrat. And then there are some very moderate and some might say liberal Republicans. If you look at Susan Collins in Maine, the senator from Maine, and the senator from Alaska, whose name escapes me at this moment, Lisa Murkowski, they're much more moderate, much more liberal. And so even though they identify with their specific political party, their ideology doesn't always match up. And so ideology is going to be something that we really need to pay attention to. But there are, as I said, very significant differences among states because the Republicans of Texas are going to look much different than the Republicans of California, simply because we develop different political cultures in different states, and they're not all going to match up. And so just because we are consider ourselves Democrats do not mean that we must be liberal. And just because we consider ourselves a Republican does not necessarily mean that we must be conservative. And so we're going to look at more at this as we move forward. And so we're going to look at the evolution of political parties in Texas. And so the two major parties really have alternated in terms of their relative positions of dominance and weakness over time. Um, we, if you go and do the required reading and you see the Miller and the Perry article, it's really going to take you through the different eras of Texas, the politics of the Republic of Texas, the annexation and the Civil War era, the one-party Democratic era in Texas, and then the shift to party realignment to the Republican Party a little bit later. It's all going to take you through that history, and we're not going to cover that history in lecture because it would be redundant because of that article, but it is part of your required reading. But understand that since the end of the Civil War, our state, between the end of the Civil War until about 1994, our state was controlled by Democrats. And then in 1994, realignment is going to occur. And realignment is defined as a lasting shift of party loyalty and attachment. And so, because the Democratic Party was becoming much more liberal, the individuals who associated with themselves were not. They were very conservative. And so they started looking elsewhere for perhaps a new political party to better represent how they felt. And so it was the Republican Party that sort of emerged as the more conservative party during this time period. And so we're going to have a significant and lasting shift of party loyalty and attachment. We're going to see an exodus of Democrats from the Democratic Party in Texas leave and join the Republican Party, because the Democratic Party, although it was once a bastion of conservatism, as time progressed, it became more and more liberal. And so they looked to another political party to sort of, become part of the ranks, and the Republicans are going to become much more conservative. And so in the 1980s and the 1990s, several politicians in Texas, famous politicians in Texas, are actually going to switch political parties. Some very big names like Rick Perry, the longest-serving Republican governor or the longest-serving governor in Texas history. He was a Republican who served for 14 years. He was a Democrat to begin with. He shifted to the Republican Party because of this realignment. Phil Gramm, who was a senator from Texas, began as a Democrat and shifted to the Republican Party. And so you're going to see some very significant politicians sort of redefine who they are, and they're going to realign with a new political party. Now, realignment is not a temporary deviation. It's not a Republican who votes for a Democrat in one election cycle and then goes back to the Republican Party. In fact, realignment is characterized by a very long-lasting shift. And as the political landscape has evolved in Texas, we can actually say that a realignment has taken place, because it's going to be from about 1994 on up until 2019 and the foreseeable future that the Republicans have taken over and dominated dominated the state politics. And so a realignment has occurred in Texas because it has been this widespread and very lasting shift of party loyalty and attachment. So it is a long-lasting change. All right, we're going to stop here for this lecture, and when we come back, we're going to look at a little bit more of political parties. We're going to continue looking at the political system in the state of Texas, so I will see you then.